The summer of 1988 found Keith Reinhardt at a crossroads. The 50-year-old sports writer from Chicago's suburbs had grown restless with the predictable rhythm of his daily existence. Seeking transformation, he arranged a 3-month hiatus from his position at the Daily Herald. He ventured west to Silver Plume, Colorado, a picturesque mountain community tucked away in the Rockies. Reinhardt arrived with an ambitious agenda. Conquering his lifelong fear of heights by tackling mountain peaks and rebuilding his physical fitness were top of mind. But there was something much more he wanted to do. He wanted to finally pen the novel he'd been thinking of for years. To sustain himself financially during this reinvention, he established an antique shop in a space that carried an eerie history. It was the former location of a bookstore operated by Tom Young, a local resident who had vanished without explanation the previous year. The mystery of Young's fate quickly captivated Reinhardt's imagination. On September 7, 1987, Young had disappeared alongside his beloved dog, Gus. The puzzle remained unsolved until July 1988, when hunters stumbled upon their remains scattered across the mountainous terrain surrounding Silver Plume. Both had suffered fatal bullet wounds to the head, with a weapon discovered at the scene. Officials determined Young's death to be voluntary, yet this verdict stirred controversy among townspeople who knew the man's devotion to his canine companion. Many found it inconceivable that he would harm Gus, even if he was set on doing himself in. The circumstances surrounding Young's demise became the foundation for Reinhardt's literary project. He crafted a protagonist named Guy Gypsum, weaving together elements of his own identity with Young's story. And yeah, that's a real Chad Tier detective name if I've ever heard one. His research consumed him as he interviewed locals, gathering fragments of Young's life and character. The boundary between Reinhardt's emerging fiction and his daily reality began to dissolve as he delved deeper into the case. Then came August 7th, 1988, exactly 1 week after the grisly discovery of Young's remains. Reinhardt shuttered his antique shop and announced to friends his intention to scale Pendleton Mountain's summit. This is a demanding expedition that typically requires several hours of arduous hiking. What made his decision particularly alarming was the timing. He departed around 4:30 p.m., far too late for such an undertaking, and his preparation was woefully inadequate. Observers noted his casual attire, tennis shoes and everyday clothing, along with his complete absence of hiking supplies. He promised to return by 10 that night, a deadline that came and went without his return. The response was swift and comprehensive. More than 100 search personnel mobilized, supported by helicopters and specially trained canines, combing the unforgiving landscape for any trace of the missing writer. The operation faced constant obstacles from the treacherous terrain, yielding no clues about Reinhardt's whereabouts. Tragedy compounded the mystery when a Cessna aircraft participating in the search crashed, claiming the pilot's life. After 7 days of fruitless efforts, the authorities abandoned the search. Multiple theories have emerged to explain Reinhardt's vanishing. One possibility suggests he encountered violence. It's been speculated that after discovering dangerous information related to Young's death, this made him a target. And I must place emphasis on the word speculation here, since there's no evidence whatsoever that indicated that he had any special knowledge of what happened to Young and Gus. An alternative explanation proposes that he orchestrated his own disappearance, drawing inspiration from his fictional character and seeking to escape into a new existence. Yet those closest to Reinhardt reject this notion, emphasizing his satisfaction with life and his consistent communication with family and friends. An accident remains another viable explanation for his fate. Considering his documented fear of heights and the perilous mountain conditions, a fatal fall seems entirely possible. The puzzle deepens, however, with the thorough search's failure to uncover any physical evidence supporting this theory. Some suggest that Reinhard had become so obsessed with Young's case that he ended up following in his footsteps. To those who believe this theory, the parallels between these two cases create a clear, unsettling pattern. Young and Reinhard occupied the identical commercial space, and both vanished in the mountains surrounding Silver Plume. Reinhard was, of course, also actively developing a novel centered on Young's story when he himself disappeared. Despite persistent investigative efforts, no definitive answers have surfaced regarding Reinhard's ultimate fate. His case files remain active, perpetuating an enduring enigma that continues to cast shadows over Silver Plume's tranquil facade. It seems to me that the depth of Reinhard's fixation with Young's case can't be understated. He had become so thoroughly absorbed in the mystery that he constructed a fictional alter ego blending their identities. This obsession potentially destabilized his judgment, possibly driving him toward the fateful, ill-conceived mountain expedition that sealed his own mysterious fate. He just doesn't seem to have been in a good place mentally, and his decision to go hiking at that hour in that attire indicates to me he may not have wanted to have come back. On a bright winter morning in 2019, an Icelandic tourist stepped out of his Dublin hotel and vanished without a trace. Jon Jonsson, a 41-year-old father of four, walked away from the Bonington Hotel on February 9, 2019, and was never seen again. His phone, wallet, and passport were left behind in his room, turning a fun poker holiday into a completely baffling mystery that remains unsolved. Jon was a taxi driver from Iceland, described by family as a reliable, caring man and devoted father. He was engaged to his fiancée, Jana, and the couple traveled to Dublin for both leisure and competitive poker. As an avid poker player in a country where casino gambling is mostly illegal, Jon was excited to join the Dublin Poker Festival at the Bonington Hotel. He had planned to play in a 3-day tournament and then tour Ireland with Jana, a trip he had looked forward to for weeks. Nothing in his background suggested he would simply disappear. He had no history of impulsive behavior and had even recently renewed his taxi license back home, anticipating his future plans. Jon arrived in Ireland on February 8, 2019, one day ahead of his fiancée due to a passport mix-up. He spent that first night at the poker tables in the hotel. Witnesses said Jon lost a significant sum of money, several thousand euros, but didn't seem visibly upset. He drank heavily, yet remained in good spirits, socializing with other players late into the night. The next morning, Jana met Jon at the hotel around 10 a.m. and went downstairs briefly to get a coffee. In that short window of time at approximately 11:05 a.m., Jon abruptly left the hotel on foot. He took only his jacket and possibly a key card, leaving his passport, phone, wallet, and even his luggage behind in the room. Security cameras captured Jon walking calmly down Swords Road minutes later, heading north through the Whitehall district of Dublin. He was last seen on CCTV outside a nursing home adjacent to the hotel around 11:07 a.m., after which the trail went cold. In the footage, Jon appeared relaxed and unhurried, smoking a cigarette as he walked. He didn't seem to be fleeing or in a hurry to meet anyone, a fact that deepened the confusion about why he left and where he went. When he failed to return that day, Jana grew alarmed. By the next morning, with still no sign of him, she reported him missing. Jon's family flew to Dublin immediately to assist in the search, utterly perplexed at how he could vanish in a busy city. Irish authorities and volunteers launched extensive searches of the area in the days after Jon's disappearance. Police scoured CCTV from traffic and businesses, and they appealed to the public for any sightings. Over the following weeks, Dozens of possible sightings and tips were investigated, but none led anywhere concrete. Notably, his bank accounts and credit cards saw no activity after he went missing, and there were no records of him leaving the country via airports or ferries. Detectives determined that all his personal effects left in the hotel suggested he intended to return, deepening this true crime mystery further. Years went by with little progress until some ominous leads emerged. In 2022 and 2023, two anonymous letters were delivered, one to a Dublin police station and another to a local priest. They claimed that Jan had been slain and buried in a park called Santry Domain. The letters mentioned that his remains would be found among trees near water in that park. Acting on this tip, the cops launched a major search of the park in February 2024, using cadaver dogs and dive teams to probe the park's lake and wooded areas. For a moment, hope flickered when search dogs indicated a spot of interest near the water, and parts of the ground were excavated. However, after days of effort, nothing was discovered, and the search concluded without answers. One hypothesis has pointed to an unconfirmed underworld connection as being behind his fate. This rumor suggests Jan may have crossed paths with dangerous individuals over the poker money. It was reported that the 4,000 euros he lost might have belonged to an Icelandic criminal present in Dublin, and that Jan met with this person to obtain more cash before violence broke out. An even more startling theory from early 2025 claims that he was an unintended victim of a contract killer. In this scenario, a hired hitman from Eastern Europe came to the poker tournament, targeting a different Icelandic player, but mistakenly killed Jan instead. Disturbingly, since the theory initially came forward, according to the Irish Times, multiple independent sources have come forward with similar information. As of today, Jan Jansson's fate is still unknown. His loved ones continue to push for answers, refusing to let the case be forgotten. They hold on to hope that someone, somewhere, will come forward with the missing piece of the puzzle. Personally, though, I suspect that if the hitman theory is true, we're never going to have any meaningful resolution to this case. In the pre-dawn darkness of January 15, 2013, shots erupted near Mexico's northeastern border. By sunrise, whispers spread that a notorious cartel boss had been slain, yet no official confirmation came. The fallen figure was Hector David Delgado Santiago, better known by his alias El Metro Cuatro, or simply M4. His death would soon plunge the Gulf Cartel into turmoil, as everyone from the authorities to the cartel itself tried to figure out who was behind this major league hit. Delgado was a high-ranking leader of Mexico's Gulf Cartel, born and raised in Matamoros. He earned his alias as a member of Los Metros, a highly feared and violent enforcement wing of the cartel. Rising through the ranks over the years, Delgado became the local boss of Reynosa, a key border city. From there, he worked his way up to being the right-hand man of the Gulf Cartel boss, Mario Ramirez Trevino. Unlike flashier cartel figures, Delgado kept a low profile, working in the shadows and staying off law enforcement radar. Nevertheless, he gained a grim reputation as a ruthless enforcer who was even willing to attack American government agents directly. As 2013 began, a storm was brewing in the cartel underworld. In the early hours of January 15, 2013, violent clashes broke in Matamoros and Reynosa. Amid the chaos, M4 was reportedly caught in a firefight with an unknown band of bad hombres. Initial reports indicated that he was shot and gravely wounded in the fray. According to local accounts, he was rushed into surgery at a Reynosa hospital around 3:30 a.m., but succumbed to his wounds during the operation. Convoys of Gulf Cartel vehicles poured into the streets in a show of force as gunmen loyal to Delgado prowled the city. Panic and uncertainty gripped Reynosa's residents. Many sheltered in place as rumors of a fallen kingpin swirled. Confusion reigned supreme in the immediate aftermath, and Mexican authorities remained conspicuously silent. No official statement was released about Delgado's death, a stark contrast to the usual publicity that follows a cartel boss's demise. Within a day, trusted sources confirmed what many suspected. Delgado Santiago was indeed dead and swiftly buried in Matamoros. With official silence came rampant speculation about who took out this top Gulf cartel leader on his home turf. Two main theories soon emerged in both media reports and according to later underworld chatter that would leak out in the years that followed. One theory holds that Los Zetas, the Gulf cartel's former paramilitary wing turned bitter enemies, infiltrated Reynosa and targeted Delgado for assassination. Reynosa was traditionally a Gulf stronghold, and there's reason to believe the Zetas may have had a reason to penetrate into this territory. In fact, months before, Gulf enforcers had pushed into the Zetas' territory around Monterrey, dealing heavy blows to the Zetas. If their operatives managed to hit a top boss in Reynosa, it may have been a retaliatory strike, a message that even in his own territory, he wasn't safe. Observers at the time noted that a Zetas-led attack would fit a larger pattern of tit-for-tat violence between the cartels. This scenario paints his death as part of the ongoing war for turf, an outside enemy seizing a chance to eliminate a key member of the Gulf cartel's leadership. The alternative theory is far more insidious. Delgado was betrayed and eliminated by his own compatriots within the Gulf cartel. At the time, the cartel was embroiled in a fierce internal feud. Delgado himself had been a key player in a split that pitted two heavily armed rival factions against one another. Ultimately, given the internal power structures of these operations, this has been the conclusion that many observers have reached in the years following the slaying. In the end, perhaps to the surprise of absolutely no one, this case has gone unsolved, and I have a sneaking suspicion that it'll remain that way. On a Halloween night in a quiet Northern California suburb, a Placer County Sheriff's deputy noticed an abandoned Dodge Caravan on a roadside. Inside the vehicle was a scene out of a nightmare: the lifeless body of 39-year-old Sherilyn Hockley, a beloved fifth-grade teacher, lying in the back seat. The shocking discovery on October 31st, 1993, shattered the peace of Granite Bay and launched an investigation that has haunted the community for decades. Over 30 years later, Sherilyn's slaying remains unsolved. Sherilyn Hockley was a mother of three and an admired teacher who had recently moved to the Granite Bay area after a divorce. On Friday, October 29, 1993, her elementary school hosted Halloween festivities, and Sherilyn stayed late to clean up after the classroom party. She was last seen at the school sometime between 5 and 6 p.m. Sherilyn reportedly planned to head to her boyfriend's house that evening, but she never arrived. When Sherilyn didn't come home that night, her boyfriend grew alarmed. He drove to the school around 7:30 p.m. looking for her and even spoke with a janitor, but found no sign of Sherilyn or her van. As concern mounted, he contacted family and the authorities to report her missing. Her disappearance was entirely out of character. Sherilyn was reliable and deeply devoted to her family and her students. As the weekend passed with no word from her, family and friends feared the worst while clinging to hope. Their worst fears were confirmed on Halloween night. On October 31st, a sheriff's deputy on routine patrol noticed Sherilyn's blue Dodge minivan sitting oddly alongside Elmhurst Drive, just about a mile from the school. Numerous local residents had actually seen the van parked there throughout the weekend while attending kids' soccer games. Some assumed it was merely an abandoned vehicle, while others assumed someone may have been living in it. Either way, no one approached the van at that time. When the deputy stopped to check it out, he made a gruesome discovery. Cherylyn's body was in the back of the van. She was partially clothed and had been strangled with a ligature, left lifeless in her own vehicle. Detectives from the Placer County Sheriff's Office descended on the scene, trying to piece together what had happened to the well-liked teacher. The evidence painted a perplexing picture. Cherylyn had clearly been strangled, likely with a rope or cord, but that weapon wasn't found wrapped around her neck. Investigators recovered a piece of rope believed to be the weapon used in the attack, preserving it for forensic testing. Crucially, the crime didn't fit the pattern of a random attack. Cherylyn's purse, wallet, and personal belongings were still inside the van, untouched. Tests to determine if she had been subjected to an indecent assault came back negative as well. The location of the van and condition of the scene raised further questions. Detectives theorized that Cherylyn may not have been slain at the spot where the van was found. There were no signs of a struggle in that wooded roadside area, and no clear secondary crime scene was ever identified nearby. It seemed likely that the assailant subdued Cherylyn elsewhere, perhaps even in the school parking lot. He then drove her van to the quiet street where it was abandoned with her body inside. Investigators believe Cherylyn was slain on Friday evening, the 29th, or early the next morning, and the perp left the van in plain sight. It's believed that he had hoped it would blend in for some time until the body was discovered. Forensic teams combed over the vehicle for clues. They lifted fingerprints, but unfortunately, none of the prints matched any known person in law enforcement databases. No DNA profile was immediately obtained in 1993, as DNA testing was limited at the time, but evidence was carefully stored. The investigation faced a daunting challenge: a crime with no obvious motive, few physical leads, and a victim who by all accounts had no enemies. In any case like this, investigators start by looking at those closest to the victim. Cherylyn's recent personal life was scrutinized for clues. She had finalized a divorce earlier that year after a 15-year marriage, and her 3 children were living with their father in Chico, California after the split. Detectives interviewed her ex-husband and her current boyfriend, and both men were cooperative. After checking alibis and finding no evidence of involvement, police cleared the ex-husband and the boyfriend of any suspicion early on. Eliminating these 2 key figures was important, but it also meant the case had no obvious suspect to follow. Investigators cast a wider net. They looked into colleagues at the school and any other men in Cherylyn's life, but nothing pointed to a specific person with motive. The principal of her school noted that Cherylyn appeared to have a good personal life. In fact, colleagues recalled that on the day she disappeared, Cherylyn was in an upbeat mood, excited about the Halloween weekend, and enjoying time with her students. With those closest to Cherylyn yielding no leads, police pursued scenarios with strangers. One early tip involved reports of an unknown man seen hanging around the school parking lot in a Volkswagen on the day Cherylyn vanished. This raised suspicions of a possible stalker or would-be abductor. It's unclear whether this individual was ever tracked down, with some sources claiming he was cleared and others claiming he was never found. It appears to me that he was likely never found, since the cops released a forensic sketch based on the description of the man. Another avenue was the possibility of a serial offender. Just 2 years prior, in 1991, a woman named Cindy Wanner had been kidnapped and strangled in the same general area of Placer County. This case also remains unsolved to this day, but the cops were unable to find any connection between the two. Over time, Two broad main theories about Cherylyn's case have emerged. Either she was slain by someone she knew in a personal crime of passion, or she was the victim of a random attack by an unknown predator. The prevailing theory, however, is that Cherylyn likely knew the perpetrator, given the lack of theft or other clear motivations for the crime. The only motive for the attack, based on the evidence as it exists, appears to have been ending the life of an innocent woman. Notably, in one quote from a 2015 interview, a detective working the case indicated that the name of the suspect was likely somewhere in the case file. Since it's an active and ongoing investigation, nothing further was said beyond this cryptic statement. Notably, it's not entirely clear whether the rope found at the scene has produced a DNA profile in the intervening years. It's also unclear if the rope found was even the weapon used in the commission of the crime, and again, given the status of the investigation, we don't have all the details. For now, the unsolved case of Cherylyn Hockley continues to haunt her family and investigators. Cherylyn's adult children are still advocating for justice, which definitely increases the chance that this case will be cracked eventually. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here, with a quick reminder to like, subscribe, and share this video. Also, don't forget to check out the YouTube membership or the Patreon if you want to help support my channel even further. On a calm February night in 1975, two young boys in Kofu, Japan stumbled upon something that defied explanation. As dusk fell, they watched a strange orange light dancing in the sky, a light that soon descended behind a vineyard, bringing them face to face with the unknown in their own backyard. What began as a playful outing would become one of Japan's most baffling close encounters, leaving a community grasping for answers. By the end of that night, the two children had experienced something that remains unexplained even today. On February 23, 1975, around 6:30 in the evening, two 7-year-old boys, Masato Kawano and Katsuhiro Yamahata, were roller skating in Kofu City. While they were enjoying the evening, they noticed not one but two glowing saucer-shaped objects hovering above. The UFOs emitted a glittering orange light and a strange ticking sound. As the boys watched in awe, one of the lights suddenly veered off toward a distant mountain, while the other descended into a nearby vineyard. Curious and alarmed, the children ran to the vineyard. Up close, they found a domed metallic craft about 20 feet wide and 7 feet tall, resting on 3 spindly legs. Strange symbols were etched along its silvery hull. As they hesitantly approached, a hatch opened and a small humanoid figure clambered down a ladder to the ground. The boys also glimpsed a second, smaller figure inside the craft's cockpit, watching from above. The being on the ground stood only about 4 feet tall, with long, thin arms, a large head, and a reflective silver suit that seemed to glow. Its skin was dark brown and deeply wrinkled, obscuring any eyes or nose on its face. Where a mouth should be, it had 3 shiny metal fang-like projections pointing down. The creature even had pointed bat-like ears jutting from its head. It moved slowly around the craft, seemingly unaware of the two stunned boys. Without warning, the humanoid turned and walked directly toward Katsuhiro. Before the boy could run, the entity placed a hand on his shoulder, patting him twice. It emitted an eerie warbling noise, a garbled sound unlike any human language they had ever heard. At that moment, Katsuhiro collapsed to the ground, paralyzed, whether from terror or some effect of the touch. Panicked, Masato grabbed his friend and they fled from the vineyard as fast as they could. Breathless and shaking, the boys burst into their homes and told their parents an incredible story of a flying saucer and its frightening occupant. Skeptical but concerned, the mothers accompanied the boys back to the vineyard. They arrived just in time to see an orange light pulsing among the grapevines, right at the spot the children had pointed out. Moments later, the light blinked rapidly and then shot straight up into the sky, vanishing with a flash. In the silence that followed, the adults found physical signs that something had been there. The wooden posts of two grapevines were snapped off at the base, seemingly knocked over by a heavy force. In the soil, there was a ring of small depressions, as if left by the craft's legs, and some reports noted unusual radiation readings in the ground. By the next day, word of the Kofu UFO was spreading through the town. Classmates, neighbors, and teachers all heard about the boys' encounter. The school principal and several teachers visited the site in daylight to investigate. They confirmed the uprooted posts and strange landing marks in the soil. The two boys were interviewed separately by parents, teachers, and even an investigator, but their accounts didn't waver. They described the same events each time and drew matching pictures of the saucer and creature. Another child, an 8-year-old boy from the area, came forward to say he saw a bright orange object flying in the sky around the same time, though he hadn't seen it land. This independent sighting added credibility to the story and suggested something unexplained was indeed in the skies over Kofu that evening. News of this eerie encounter quickly spread beyond Kofu, fueling excited newspaper headlines and prompting official attention. UFO enthusiasts believed the boys had a genuine close encounter with an extraterrestrial, citing the consistency of their story and the physical evidence at the site. On the other side, skeptics proposed more ordinary explanations. Some suggested the children had misidentified a known object. Notably, the Japanese Civil Aviation Bureau pointed out that a propeller airplane was flying in the area that evening, and its lights could have been what the boys saw. However, this explanation didn't directly account for the bizarre humanoid encounter on the ground. Others theorized that the story could have been a childhood fantasy or prank that gained a life of its own. Young kids do have vivid imaginations, and some believe Masato and Katsuhiro could have concocted an alien encounter story based on a TV show or comic book. That said, reports indicate that they were genuinely frightened and earnest about what they reported. Moreover, the broken posts and corroborating witnesses made it hard to dismiss the incident as pure make-believe. This has led to the theory that the encounter could have been a hoax perpetrated by adults on these kids. No evidence of a hoax ever surfaced, and the boys never retracted their account into adulthood. Without a definitive explanation, the Kofu incident remains an unsolved mystery. Some have even speculated about a secret military experiment or an unknown creature mistaken for an alien, but none of these ideas fits all the facts. The story of what happened in that vineyard in 1975 continues to intrigue and mystify people to this day. A legend recounts that a woman once asked the Count Saint-Germain's butler if it was true the Count had already lived during the time of Christ. The butler replied dryly that he wouldn't know, as he'd only been in the Count's service for 300 years. This anecdote, whether apocryphal or not, perfectly captures the paradox of the Count of Saint-Germain. For nearly half a century, he charmed, advised, and startled the courts of Europe. He maintained an image so fantastical that Voltaire dubbed him a man who knows everything. Saint-Germain was and remains a complete mystery, serving simultaneously as a celebrated 18th century polymath and, in modern times, an immortal spiritual guide. But a closer look at the Count suggests that he was, more likely, an agent of an unknown government, trading his reputation for intelligence. Saint-Germain made his entrance onto the international scene in the mid-17th century, but his origins are mired in a fog of deliberate contradiction. He used a variety of names and titles throughout his life, an accepted practice among traveling aristocrats, but one that Saint-Germain employed to an extreme degree. This intentional obscurity allowed him to deflect inquiries and invent fantasies about his past, such as the famous claim of being 500 years old. Historical investigations suggest several possibilities for his birth. One plausible theory places his birth around 1710 in San Germano, Savoy, perhaps as the son of an Italian princess, with a local tax collector as his supposed father. He sometimes claimed to be the son of Prince Francis II Rákóczi of Transylvania. Adding to the chronological confusion, when he arrived in Schleswig in 1779, he told his then patron, Prince Charles of Hesse-Kassel, that he was 88 years old. If this was true, this would push his potential birth year back to 1691. But as with everything with the Count, nothing was certain. The sheer volume of conflicting identities suggests that the Count's obscurity was not merely happenstance, but a vital tool. Many of his contemporaries suggested that his lack of a fixed identity may have been a clue that he was actually an agent of an unknown government. By being simultaneously everyone and no one, his persona provided him with the necessary camouflage to move seamlessly between Europe's royal courts. The Count's influence derived not just from his mysterious background, but from verifiable, multidisciplinary genius. He was a polyglot, fluent in all major European languages, and a verified expert in art, philosophy, history, and science. He was also a celebrated musician, known as a virtuoso on both the piano and violin. Several of his compositions were published and performed in London and Paris, and are still available today, though none are widely performed. However, the most intriguing aspect of his reputation was his connection to the mystical science of alchemy. Saint-Germain claimed to possess knowledge of the philosopher's stone and the elixir of life, the secrets that would grant wealth and immortality. Unlike common charlatans, he had the ability to demonstrate practical material results that convinced influential patrons. A notable anecdote involves King Louis XV, who presented Saint-Germain with a deeply flawed diamond. The Count took the stone, and upon returning it a month later, it was found to be flawless. After having it weighed and appraised, the king's jeweler valued the improved stone to be far more valuable. This tale, which appears to be true, relies on the assumption that the diamond that was returned was indeed the same gem at all. This so-called ability to transform and improve materials was crucial to his career. His demonstrable skill, whether based on genuinely advanced chemical knowledge or sophisticated trickery, provided him with unparalleled access to the European elite. His success in creating valuable materials, like the improved diamond or his development of rich dyes, validated his position in court in a way mere philosophy could never have achieved. This served as a powerful shield, protecting his potentially true operational work, diplomacy, and intelligence gathering under the guise of an eccentric scientist and artist. The Count's unique position, blending incredible talents with total anonymity, made him invaluable to high-stakes statecraft. Louis XV trusted Saint-Germain implicitly, often using him for sensitive diplomatic tasks. During the height of the 7 Years' War, Saint-Germain was instrumental in secret negotiations. Around 1760, he traveled to the Dutch Republic, attempting to mediate peace talks between Britain and France. These activities were so clandestine that they immediately led to accusations of espionage, suggesting he was working for foreign powers, perhaps the Russians. Though never formally charged, these allegations underscored his role as a necessary, untraceable agent used for sensitive information transfer and back-channel operations. His connection to Russia is particularly suggestive of his influence. Saint-Germain was allegedly present in St. Petersburg and credited by some with assisting the coup in 1762 that led to the overthrow of Tsar Peter III and the ascension of Catherine the Great. Despite a life spent advising kings and claiming access to untold wealth and eternal existence, Saint Germain's historical narrative culminates in a surprisingly mundane death. He spent his final years under the protection of his admirer, Prince Charles of Hesse-Kassel, in Schleswig in modern Germany. He died on February 27, 1784, and was subsequently buried in a grave in a small church in a tiny town in Schleswig. However, the official record of his death only served as the historical inflection point for the legend of his immortality. When no relatives appeared to claim his belongings, the city auctioned off his possessions, as was the style at the time. The inventory was dramatically anticlimactic. His estate contained only modest personal effects, clothing, and a small sum of money. While most accepted this meant that he was a spy who had spent all his money or a charlatan who never had what he claimed, another story soon emerged. A modest end for a man who boasted of immortal secrets perfectly primed the public imagination for the story of his survival. Almost immediately, reports of his continued existence circulated through Europe. A French countess claimed to have met and conversed at length with Saint-Germain after the storming of the Bastille in 1789. She stated that he accurately predicted France's immediate and terrifying future. She continued to report sightings of him on significant historical dates, including in 1820, noting that he always appeared to be no older than late middle age. As the 19th century went on, these purported sightings tapered off, and for a time this mysterious count became a historical mystery and little more. But then things got really weird. In the 20th century, New Age movements began to latch on to the Count as a figure of great spiritual power. In these new esoteric doctrines, the Count was redefined as the ascended master Saint Germain, a great spiritual teacher who transcended mortality through alchemy. Present-day adherents believe he currently operates from a higher dimension, guiding and guarding humanity. Under this belief, he sits on a council with such venerated figures like Jesus Christ, Confucius, Gautama Buddha, and a whole bunch of others. The Count of Saint-Germain mastered the art of being a contradiction. He was the man who advised kings and composed beautiful music, but would also allude to the fact that he was 500 years old. He was the wealthy and successful diplomat whose life was filled with intrigue, but died with nothing but modest possessions. Even today, he continues to exist in parallel and contradictory realities. He's the frustratingly opaque, real historical figure whose life, likely as a spy in the service of an unknown power, intersected with many of the crucial decades of the Enlightenment. But he's also a New Age spiritual icon to a fairly significant group of people who hold that he's currently guiding humanity alongside Jesus Christ. It was October 12, 1944, when West Hollywood's upscale El Palacio apartments awoke to horror. A maid discovered 20-year-old oil heiress Georgette Bauerdorf lifeless in her bathtub. The bathwater was tinted pink with blood, and Georgette was half submerged and unresponsive. The cops arrived and quickly determined she was the victim of foul play. This shocking crime scene marked the beginning of a Hollywood mystery that remains unsolved to this day. Georgette was born into privilege but yearned to contribute on the home front as the world had become engulfed in conflict. After her family moved from New York to Los Angeles, she graduated from a prestigious girls' school and embraced volunteer work. By 1944, the young heiress was serving as a junior hostess at the Hollywood Canteen, a famous club where movie stars entertained American servicemen on leave. For Georgette, being a canteen hostess was both an honor and a thrill. The nightclub was co-founded by Hollywood heavy hitter Bette Davis and offered GIs food and fun. Georgette's friendly charm and generosity made her a favorite among the troops. She was known to offer weary servicemen a place to sleep at her apartment, letting them crash on her downstairs sofa while she stayed upstairs. Her friends adored her spirit, though some worried she was too trusting with strangers during these tumultuous times. On the evening of October 11th, 1944, Georgette reported for her usual Wednesday night shift at the Hollywood Canteen, greeting and dancing with servicemen as always. That night, a particularly persistent soldier kept asking her to jitterbug, a dance she disliked, but she politely deflected his requests and continued her hostess duties. Around 11:30 p.m., Georgette left the canteen and drove home alone in her black coupe. She had mentioned to at least one friend that she was expecting a late-night phone call from her boyfriend, a soldier in Texas, and needed to be home for it. In fact, she had recently purchased a plane ticket and planned to fly to El Paso soon to visit this sweetheart, a trip she would never take. Investigators later deduced that Georgette arrived at her West Hollywood apartment around midnight. An open can of green string beans and melon rinds in her trash suggested she fixed a quick snack before bed. She then changed into pajamas and perhaps began writing in her diary or reading in bed. A diary and newspaper were found open in her room, implying she was winding down for the night. At roughly 2:30 that morning, a neighbor was jolted awake by a chilling scream echoing through the building. He heard a woman crying out and pleading before the voice was suddenly silenced. Thinking it might have been a lover's quarrel that ended quickly, or perhaps even something highly spicy, the neighbor went back to sleep. When Georgette's maid, Lulu Atwood, arrived the next morning, she found the apartment door wide open and water running in the bathroom. Georgette's body was face down in an overflowing tub, wearing only her pajama top. Police at first considered the possibility of an accidental drowning, but the evidence quickly proved otherwise. The light bulb over the outside entrance had been carefully unscrewed just enough to disable it, plunging the doorway into darkness. This pointed to a calculated attack, and police suspected the perp may have entered earlier using a key and lain in wait, ambushing her once she was home. Inside, Georgette's knuckles were bruised and there were deep marks on her head and abdomen, indicating she had put up a fierce fight. The coroner found that she had been brutally assaulted and strangled. A strip of cloth had been viciously shoved down her throat to asphyxiate her. Further testing revealed that it was an unusual type of medical bandage rarely seen in America, leading to speculation her attacker was a serviceman who had acquired it overseas. Notably, there was no water in her lungs, meaning Georgette was already dead before the tub was filled. Other clues perplexed investigators. Georgette's valuable jewelry and money were left largely untouched, ruling out robbery as a motive. Only about $100 was missing from her purse, even though far greater sums of cash and jewels were in plain view. And I'm not talking about regular jewels here. This is oil baroness stuff after all. Her car was gone from the garage, and it was soon found abandoned miles away, out of gas and sporting a fresh dent on one fender. Fingerprints were lifted from the vehicle and from inside, but they matched no one in law enforcement records. Investigators also found cigarette butts on the floor of Georgette's home, an eerie discovery given that she didn't smoke. This led detectives to speculate that he may have stayed after, smoking while taking in the deed he had just committed. News of the glamorous young woman's slaying made headlines around the nation, and a task force of Los Angeles sheriff's detectives and military police sprang into action. Because of Georgette's role at the canteen, dozens of soldiers she had met were investigated. Police eliminated many potential suspects by checking military logs. Any enlisted man absent overnight without leave was scrutinized, and most were accounted for. Some of the men were targeted by investigators in a more direct way for their connection or perceived ties to Georgette. The pushy patron from the canteen was tracked down and quickly cleared. He had been signed into his barracks at the time the attack went down. Detectives also tracked a very tall soldier who Georgette had briefly dated, as well as the army sergeant to whom she'd given a ride that night. Both men were questioned, but neither was ever tied to the crime. Leads continued to surface from all corners. One disturbed man in San Francisco actually confessed, but his story turned out to be false and attention-seeking. Another suspect, picked up for an unrelated slaying in Glendale, was briefly suspected but ultimately ruled out. Because Georgette often lost her keys and had multiple duplicates made, police considered whether someone had obtained a copy to access her apartment. As I mentioned, it's believed that someone had ambushed her in her apartment. Disturbingly, he likely stayed in hiding for a significant time while she was already home. Despite extensive interviews and the tantalizing evidence left behind, every promising lead led nowhere. Georgette's father, with the help of family friend William Randolph Hearst, even pressed authorities to solve the case swiftly to avoid scandal and gossip. Months passed with no arrest, and the trail grew cold. In the years that followed, the tragic story of Georgette Bauerdorf gradually faded from the headlines. It remains unclear if any forensic evidence from the scene was stored, though I assume that since forensic genetic testing was basically 5 decades away, it wouldn't have been. However, on the off chance the evidence remains in an evidence locker somewhere, there's a faint hope that one day this California unsolved mystery may be resolved. A chilling scream rang out on a quiet West Hollywood street in the early hours of February 12, 1977. Moments later, aspiring actress Krista Helm lay dying in front of her agent's home, stabbed dozens of times in a savage attack. The perp left no witnesses and few clues behind. Decades later, the question of who killed her and why remains one of Hollywood's most baffling, unsolved mysteries of that era. Born in Milwaukee, Krista moved to New York and then Los Angeles chasing stardom, leaving behind a young daughter from a brief teenage marriage. Disturbingly, both parents effectively abandoned their daughter, though Krista promised to return at some point in the future. Needless to say, fate intervened and this promise would never be fulfilled. She landed some modeling gigs and a starring film role, a low-budget action movie called Let's Go for Broke in 1974. But the film flopped after a short run. Instead, Krista became better known as a quote-unquote socialite on the Hollywood party scene. She mingled with big names, reportedly dating NFL superstar Joe Namath, rock legend Mick Jagger, and even having some close encounters with the Shah of Iran. Ambitious and charismatic, Krista made friends in high places and enjoyed the trappings of wealth, without any real known source of income. Privately, Krista also kept a secret diary where she documented her intimate encounters, complete with candid details and a rating system for her lovers. Allegations made in the years following her death even claimed that she was working as an escort to the rich and powerful. I do have to include a disclaimer here and mention that these are just allegations, though I'm sure my description of her lifestyle may have already have had some of you thinking this. By 1977, with her career stalled and money running low, she whispered about turning her diary into fat stacks with a tell-all book. If the rumors are to be believed, she had some seriously compromising material about some sick puppies in high places, but I'll come back to that in a moment. Late on February 11th, 1977, Krista left a party in Los Angeles and drove to meet her agent at his West Hollywood home. She arrived around 1:30 a.m., but before she could reach the door, an unknown assailant ambushed her on the quiet residential street. The attackers stabbed Krista repeatedly with a knife and also struck her with a blunt object, leaving her collapsed in a pool of blood next to the curb. A passerby soon discovered her body and rushed to get help. By the time police arrived, however, Krista had already succumbed to her injuries at just 27 years old. Some reports said she was still clutching her car keys, suggesting the attacker struck the instant she stepped out of her vehicle. Neighbors later recalled hearing a single terrifying scream during the night of the attack, but no one witnessed the attacker. When investigators surveyed the scene, they realized that Krista's purse was missing, and with it, her infamous diary. Its disappearance led police to suspect that the attacker's primary motive was to take or destroy that tell-all journal. If someone feared what Krista had written, stealing the diary would eliminate the threat. Detectives also learned that Krista had allegedly sometimes tape-recorded her spicy encounters, but those audio tapes were nowhere to be found either. The vanishing of these personal items robbed investigators of crucial evidence, and strongly suggested that someone wanted Krista's secrets to die with her. With Krista's tumultuous love life and high-profile connections, the list of potential suspects was long. Investigators theorized that an ex-lover might have had a personal motive to silence her, especially if they knew about her diary and feared exposure. Given that Krista was struggling financially, she had every incentive to monetize her secrets, which could have alarmed anyone with something to hide. Over time, more clues have added to the intrigue. Krista's friends later recalled that she seemed fearful in her final days. In fact, a few months before the slaying, she sent a postcard to a close friend saying she was in over her head and might need to disappear for a while. This alarming message suggests Krista sensed danger looming. Notably, decades later, it was claimed that she was part of an elite escort operation, which some have speculated had ties to intelligence. This raised the distinct possibility she was eliminated because she knew too much about powerful people, even if they didn't know about her secret diary. In 2005, her daughter persuaded the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department to reopen the cold case for a fresh investigation. A team of detectives pored over the old evidence and tracked down witnesses who had never spoken. They uncovered a few new leads, including the discovery that Krista's close friend allegedly sent an acquaintance to clean out her apartment right after the attack. It's believed that the tapes, her illicit diary, and other personal items were removed during this process. When questioned by the authorities, the individual who allegedly orchestrated this claimed that he didn't really remember Krista and offered no information whatsoever. And for my Sopranos fans out there, according to a report by CBS News in 2008, the man who actually did the removal was allegedly Tony Sirico, who played Paulie Walnuts. I always thought he was just a good actor, but after browsing his Wikipedia article, it seems like he may have been bringing some serious life experience to the role. I don't have any evidence to directly prove it, but I can virtually guarantee that Krista wasn't taken out at random. She talked about publishing a tell-all book at a moment when her diary allegedly named celebrities, political figures, and embattled foreign royalty. She was also making audio recordings of herself with influential and powerful men, for reasons which remain unclear. It's not hard to see how someone rich and powerful would have seen her as a liability who needed to be handled. To back this up, within hours of her slaying, the items that could damage reputations vanished into the ether, never to resurface. Her apparent fear in the months before her death, including the postcard hinting she might need to disappear, adds to the sense that pressure was building. I also find it weird how her so-called friend, someone who had apparent access to her house, claimed to barely remember her decades later. But hey, maybe it was all completely random. Stranger things have happened after all. Beneath the shimmering blue surface of Lake Tahoe, at depths where sunlight fades to black, something enormous is said to stir. Locals and visitors alike have long whispered about a colossal creature lurking below, a legend affectionately known as Tahoe Tessie. Like a West Coast cousin to Scotland's Loch Ness Monster, Tessie's story blends local history, natural wonder, and a dose of mystery that refuses to die. Or in this case, perhaps it literally did die. But stick around because I'll get to that shortly. Tahoe Tessie is the name given to a supposed lake monster dwelling in the depths of Lake Tahoe, which straddles the California-Nevada border in the Sierra Nevada mountains. Descriptions of Tessie portray a long, serpentine creature with a smooth, dark, or sometimes turquoise-colored body, often likened to a prehistoric reptile. Long before Tessie became a regionally known name, the indigenous Washoe people told stories of powerful water spirits inhabiting Tahoe's waters. In Washoe legend, mysterious water babies were said to live around Cave Rock, a sacred lakeside formation, and could punish those who disturbed the lake. These tales of something uncanny in the water set the stage for later interpretations that morphed into the modern Tessie legend. However, it looks as though the Washoe people never claimed these creatures to be a serpentine entity. Rather, they were seen as spirits that protected the lake, or perhaps spirits of the lake, in an animistic sense. One of the earliest European American accounts of a Tahoe monster dates back to the mid-1800s. In 1865, a San Francisco socialite named Irving Coggin claimed he encountered an enormous serpent on the lake's shore. According to his later published account, the creature had a head 14 feet wide and a body hundreds of feet long that crushed small trees as it slithered by. Coggin insisted that sooner or later the beast would be seen by so many people that all doubt of its existence would vanish. His dramatic tale, though not verified, marked the beginning of Tessie's presence in local lore and sparked the imagination of early visitors to Tahoe. After Coggin's sensational story, reports of Tessie were sporadic for many years. It wasn't until the late 20th century that Tessie truly resurfaced in the public eye with a flurry of new sightings. In the 1980s, sightings of a large unknown creature in Lake Tahoe spiked, and many came from credibly astonished observers. One off-duty police officer, while water skiing, reported seeing a giant fish at least 10 feet long glide under him. Around the same time, an optician, a pair of nuns, and no fewer than 10 employees of the Tahoe City Post Office all claimed to have witnessed something peculiar. They saw a huge dark shape cutting through the lake's water, leaving a large wake. These independent reports, surprisingly consistent in describing a large, black, serpentine form, gave the Tessie legend a new level of legitimacy in the public's mind. Even into the 2000s, new encounters with Tessie continued to trickle in. In 2005, 2 visitors on a Tahoe beach reported seeing a large, dark shape with multiple hump-like peaks emerge about 100 yards offshore before submerging again. This, of course, is a classic lake monster sighting, albeit with no photos to prove it. Around the same time, other boaters and swimmers would occasionally describe unexplained disturbances in the water. However, in recent years, these sightings have grown infrequent, curiously right in time for everyone to have high-quality cameras on them at all times. By the 2010s and beyond, reports of Tessie largely dried up, leading some locals to half-jokingly wonder if the creature might have bit the biscuit. With no hard evidence of Tessie's existence, people have proposed a range of theories to explain what might be behind the sightings. These ideas run the gamut from biological possibilities to optical illusions and pure folklore. Many suspect that sightings of Tessie could really be encounters with an unusually large fish. The prime candidate is a sturgeon, a massive prehistoric-looking fish known to reach up to 12 feet in length and sporting a long, shark-like form. Sturgeons are bottom feeders and not native to Lake Tahoe, but researchers have noted it's possible one could have been introduced and survived in the deep waters. Such a fish surfacing could easily be mistaken for a monster, since it unironically does appear to be a prehistoric beast. In fact, in the 1980s, a team of biologists concluded that a large sturgeon was the most likely explanation for the Tahoe monster reports at the time. Personally, I like this theory, since it does acknowledge that the abundance of strange sightings may have had a basis in reality. It also means that this creature may have simply gone to the great pond in the sky, causing reports to dry up. Plus, having seen live sturgeons in a captive setting, I can only imagine what it would look like running into one of those puppies in the wild. Some Tessie enthusiasts have suggested the creature could be a holdover from the age of dinosaurs, perhaps a plesiosaur or other ancient marine reptile that somehow survived in isolation. This idea is inspired by Tessie's long neck and paddle-like hump descriptions, which sound similar to portrayals of the Loch Ness Monster. However, scientists are quick to point out serious issues with this theory. Lake Tahoe in its current form is only about 2 to 3 million years old, far younger than any dinosaur, and it's a freshwater alpine lake with no direct link to the prehistoric seas. In short, there's no scientific basis to believe a marine dinosaur could be hiding in Tahoe. The simplest explanation, of course, is that Tessie isn't a creature at all, but rather a case of mistaken identity and natural optical illusions. Lake Tahoe's waters are known for their clarity and peculiar wave patterns. Wind gusts and boat wakes can create strange humps and ripples on the lake surface that can look uncannily like a multi-humped creature swimming along. Floating logs, driftwood, or even clusters of aquatic plants can also form serpent-like shapes, especially when viewed at a distance or at twilight. Many reported sightings of Tessie have likely been people seeing these sorts of phenomena and misinterpreting them as a monster. Human perception is easily tricked by the play of light and water, a fact well documented in other lakes known for monster legends. In Lake Tahoe's case, the combination of extremely deep water, wave conditions, and the power of suggestion might be enough to convince observers that something big is in there. So for any long-time viewers of my channel, you'll know that I have something that I like to call the law of lake monsters. The law is simple. If there's a statue of the lake monster by the lake, it's definitely 100% a real creature. No more questions asked. Unfortunately for Tessie, she doesn't make the cut, because as far as I can tell, there's no Tessie monument by the lake. So hey, if you live or vacation in the Lake Tahoe region and you're invested in this lake legend, consider crowdfunding a statue. Hey everyone, Jimmy here once again with a quick reminder to hit that notification bell and turn on all notifications. Also, don't forget to click that share button and send my video to your friends and family who enjoy true crime and mystery content. For 4 years, no one even realized that Heather Bloom was missing. From late 2005 until 2009, her disappearance went entirely unreported, a delay that hindered efforts to find her. Heather was a 28-year-old woman with Down syndrome who depended on others for every aspect of her care. Yet she managed to vanish without a trace from Berkeley, California in 2005 on a trip from New York where her mother dumped her off with her sister. Even more chilling, the only person who might know what happened refused to let anyone see Heather and then quietly left the country in the years that followed. It seemed unthinkable that a vulnerable woman like Heather could vanish without anyone noticing, but it happened. Nearly 2 decades later, the question remains, what really happened to Heather Bloom? Heather had spent her entire life in New York, so a trip to California was a major change for her. Heather's story took a mysterious turn in the fall of 2005 when she and her mother stayed with Heather's sister Sherry. This visit would be the last time Heather was seen by anyone outside her family. During the stay, police were called to Sherry's apartment to intervene in a loud argument between Phyllis, the mother, and Sherry, with Heather in the middle of the commotion. The officers diffused the situation, and once things calmed down, Phyllis returned home to New York, leaving Heather in Sherry's care at the Berkeley apartment. That unusual handoff of Heather to Sherry marked the beginning of Heather's unexplained absence. For a while, nothing apparently seemed amiss, and after Phyllis left California, she apparently lost contact with both of her daughters. She heard no updates from Sherry and had no direct communication with Heather. Heather, a vulnerable adult who couldn't speak for herself, simply vanished from public view. There were no familiar neighbors or friends in California to notice her absence, and Heather wasn't enrolled in any local care programs or services that might have raised an alarm. It wasn't until June 2009, nearly 4 years later, that Phyllis finally reported Heather missing. When Berkeley police opened a missing person investigation in 2009, they were already years behind. Detectives discovered that Sherry had moved out of her apartment back in 2007, leaving no sign of where Heather had gone. It took months to track Sherry down, and when they finally located her in March 2010, the mystery only deepened. Sherry refused to let officers inside her home, speaking to them only through a window. She insisted that Heather was fine, but would not allow anyone to see her, offering no evidence of her sister's well-being. This evasive behavior raised immediate red flags for the police, who feared for Heather's safety. However, it also put law enforcement in a bind. They were alarmed, but without clear evidence of wrongdoing or a court order, there was little they could do to force Sherry's compliance. Police soon uncovered more unsettling details. Sherry's landlord and neighbors reported that they had never seen Heather at the apartment, not even once. Shortly after that tense welfare check, Sherry abruptly packed up and moved again, disappearing before authorities could learn anything more about Heather's fate. She was evicted from the apartment for owing around $13,000 in back rent, suggesting a chaotic and unstable situation. Once Sherry left town this time, the trail to find Heather went cold again. Years passed with no sign of either sister. Finally, in 2016, a breakthrough. Investigators learned that Sherry had left the country and gone to Norway on a student visa. She had moved overseas for school, which explained why she had been so hard to find. Sherry's relocation abroad posed a major roadblock for the investigation. Berkeley police and local journalists tried to contact Sherry in Norway, but she never responded. Given Heather's disabilities, it seemed unlikely she could have traveled overseas under the radar. Most likely, if she was still alive, she remained somewhere in California. But with Sherry out of reach and refusing to cooperate, authorities had no leads on where to look next, and no way to verify Heather's condition or whereabouts. Several theories have emerged to explain Heather Bloom's disappearance. The most direct suspicion falls on Sherry. As the last person with Heather, Sherry's odd behavior has led many to believe she knows exactly what happened. Her refusal to produce Heather on demand and her pattern of abruptly moving away suggest she may have been hiding something all along. Neighbors didn't report seeing Heather around at any time. This fuels a grim theory that Heather may have perished under Sherry's care, whether due to untreated health issues, an accident, or even something more sinister. For the first two options, there's always the potential that Sherry panicked and covered it up instead of reporting it. However, authorities have found no evidence of foul play and have not charged Sherry with any crime. Officially, Heather remains a missing person, not a confirmed crime victim. Another possibility is that Heather is alive but was secretly placed in a care facility or with a caretaker, and even the police have entertained this hopeful scenario. Perhaps Sherry became overwhelmed by the responsibility and without telling anyone, arranged for Heather to live in a private care home or with another caregiver. It's even possible that she took her out of state to dump her off somewhere else, perhaps simply leaving her abandoned in a hospital waiting room. If so, Sherry's secretiveness could have been her way of avoiding legal trouble for abandoning her dependent sister. This theory lines up with the optimism police expressed, the hope that somewhere, Heather has been receiving the care she needs, even if her identity isn't known to authorities. However, so far, checks of hospitals and care homes haven't turned up any trace of Heather under another identity, but the possibility cannot be ruled out. Perhaps the most sinister allegation is that Heather's mother and sister colluded to make her quote-unquote disappear. Some have speculated that Phyllis might have willingly left Heather with Sherry as part of a plan. Moving Heather across the country would make her absence in New York much less noticeable, and would provide an easy explanation for why Heather was no longer there. However, this allegation falls apart extremely quickly under scrutiny. It was Phyllis who eventually sounded the alarm in 2009, an unlikely move if she had intended for Heather's disappearance to go unnoticed as it had been. Authorities have never implicated Phyllis in any wrongdoing, and officially she was a distraught parent seeking help to find her missing child. Though of course it's inescapable that even in the official version of events told by Phyllis, it appears she dumped off her disabled daughter with her non-disabled daughter. After that, Phyllis washed her hands clean of both of them for 4 years, which brings me to my next point. One lingering question is why Phyllis waited so long to report Heather missing, and what triggered her to eventually do so. It's an aspect of the case that continues to baffle observers. We may never know what was going through the mother's mind during those 4 years. What is certain is that the delay in reporting has made investigating Heather's disappearance that much more difficult. This lost time is one of the most frustrating facets of the case, leaving basically everyone to wonder if the outcome might have been different had the alarm been raised sooner. Another question that's been raised is who was cashing Heather's government checks intended for her care during those 4 years, if anyone. I suspect the authorities already know the answer to this question, and simply haven't released this to the public. However, I do question whether a forensic accountant has looked over the accounts of both Sherry and Phyllis, though I suspect that isn't possible since neither have been implicated officially. Today, nearly 20 years after she vanished, there is still no answer to Heather Bloom's fate. Heather would be in her late 40s now, but no one knows whether she is alive or not. However, I'm hopeful that the simplest solution is the accurate one in this case. Heather may have been abandoned as an unknown person somewhere safe, and she's now being cared for by the state. It's not ideal by any means, and it's both incredibly sad and infuriating, but the alternatives are so much more disturbing. Of course, the conduct of the sister and the mother is already disturbing regardless. Heather needed love and care, and it appears that at best, she got abandonment twice, by 2 of the people who were supposed to love and care for her most. So yeah, this is one of those stories that really makes me question humanity, which is saying a lot considering that I constantly research and cover dark content. In the early 1980s, San Marino, California, was the picture of suburban tranquility. It was an affluent, insular community nestled near Los Angeles, a place of manicured lawns and quiet streets where serious crime felt like a distant abstraction. On one of these streets, Lorraine Road, lived a young couple just starting their life together. John Sohus, 27, was a quiet computer programmer who worked for a division of NASA. His wife, Linda, 28, was a talented and striking artist, standing 6 feet tall with auburn hair, who loved science fiction and worked at a local bookstore. They had married in 1983, and to get on their feet financially, moved into the main house of John's mother, Dee Dee. And just wait for it, because there was a guest house at play here, and it's going to factor into this story in a massive way. By all accounts, they were a happy, normal couple whose prospects were looking up. Linda had recently sold some major pieces at an art show, and they'd just bought a new pickup truck. Their domestic life, however, included an unusual element: a tenant living in Dee Dee's guest house. He called himself Christopher Chichester, a man who cultivated an air of eccentric importance. He was a master of social infiltration, understanding that in a community that valued pedigree, a fantastic story was often more compelling than a verifiable one. He told people he was a film student at the prestigious University of Southern California and hinted at royal lineage. He even handed out business cards that identified him as the 13th baronet of an ancient house, and at other times he name-dropped his Mountbatten cousins. For those of you who are unaware, Mountbatten is the official anglicization of the German name Battenberg, used by the House of Windsor, the British royal family. By dropping this slyly into conversations, he hinted to those in the know that he was from the high nobility at minimum. By joining a local church and charming the wealthy older residents, they gave him the social cover he needed to operate. They believed they were interacting with someone who could potentially be a real British royal. In return, he was able to semi-legitimately say he was friends with these wealthy and influential people. While many were intrigued, Linda wasn't, and she found Chichester creepy, and she and John made a point to avoid him. Then, in February 1985, the quiet life on Lorraine Road fractured. John and Linda told friends and family they were leaving for a couple of weeks for a top-secret government job interview for John in New York. After that, they simply vanished, leaving behind everything, including Linda's 4 beloved cats. In the weeks following the couple's disappearance, Christopher Chichester became the sole narrator of their story. He skillfully wove a tale designed to deflect suspicion and delay investigation, telling concerned friends that John and Linda were on a secret government mission and couldn't be contacted. To Dee Dee, he positioned himself as her official go-between, the only person who knew the details of her son's clandestine work. Initially, Dee Dee clung to this story, even repeating it to police and telling them she couldn't say more for fear of endangering the couple. But as weeks turned into months, the narrative began to fray. Bill collectors started calling for John and Linda, and friends grew more anxious. Dee Dee's confidence in Chichester crumbled, replaced by a creeping dread. She descended into the bottle and became a recluse, haunted by the silence from her son, and she perished in 1988, never knowing the truth of what happened to her son. The cover-up was a strange mix of elaborate cunning and breathtaking arrogance. To lend his story credibility, a series of postcards, seemingly written by Linda, were sent from Paris to her mother and friends. This was the cunning part, physical proof to sustain the lie long enough for him to make his escape. Yet, the execution was deeply flawed, and Linda's family knew she didn't have a passport or the money for a European trip. This recklessness was a core part of the perpetrator's psychology. When a San Marino detective finally came to the guest house to question him about the missing couple, Chichester met him at the door completely unclothed. He claimed to be a nudist and refused to dress up at all, just letting it all hang out for the detective. It was a bizarre act of dominance and deflection that ended the interview. And shortly after this encounter, Chichester also vanished. I really question how the detective managed to be taken seriously after letting a criminal escape in such a bizarre way. The case went cold until 1988, when the couple's pickup truck was discovered in Greenwich, Connecticut. The man who had been driving it, now using the alias Christopher Crow, disappeared before police could question him. The mystery lay dormant for years, and Didi Sohus's house on Lorraine Road was sold, and the strange story of the vanished couple faded into local lore. Then, in May 1994, the new owners decided to install a swimming pool in the backyard. As excavators dug into the earth, they struck something solid. It was a fiberglass box containing plastic bags, and inside were the dismembered remains of a body. Forensic analysis revealed the remains belonged to an adult white male who had been slain through savage violence. The victim's skull had been crushed by multiple blows from a blunt object, and his body had been subject to further indignities. The brutality suggested a crime of intense personal rage, while the methodical dismemberment and burial pointed to a cold-blooded attempt to conceal the evidence. Though police strongly suspected the victim was John Sohus, confirming it was a challenge. John had been adopted, so there were no known biological relatives against whom to compare DNA samples. It wasn't until 2011, with the advent of new forensic technology, that the bones were conclusively identified as those of John. While the Sohus case languished, the man once known as Christopher Chichester was busy constructing a new life, or rather, a series of them. After fleeing California, the German immigrant Christian Karl Gerhardsreiter moved to Greenwich, Connecticut, and reinvented himself as Christopher Crowe, a supposed Hollywood producer. He was a charming man who spoke German fluently, and no one who speaks German could be a bad man, right? He talked his way into jobs at Wall Street brokerage firms, but his cons were clumsy. He was fired from one after it was discovered he was using the social security number of serial predator David Berkowitz. He then moved on to his most audacious and successful impersonation. Relocating to New York and Boston, he became Clark Rockefeller, an eccentric and reclusive heir to the legendary American dynasty. As Rockefeller, Gerhardsreiter achieved the status he had always craved. He joined exclusive clubs, wore ascots, and spun tales of his fabulous fictional life. His ultimate act of validation came when he met and married Sandra Boss. She was a highly successful Harvard Business School graduate and a partner at the consulting firm McKinsey. Her unimpeachable credentials gave his fraudulent identity a powerful veneer of legitimacy. Despite Boss being the sole breadwinner, earning over $1 million a year, Gerhardsreiter maintained absolute control over her finances and her life. The carefully constructed world he built began to collapse when Boss filed for divorce in 2007. She had begun to suspect that the entire identity he had constructed was indeed a complete lie, and while she wasn't able to figure who he was, she figured out he wasn't Clark Rockefeller. For a narcissist like Gerhardsreiter, the loss of control was an intolerable injury. On July 27, 2008, during a supervised visit in Boston, he executed a planned abduction of their 7-year-old daughter. The kidnapping triggered a massive FBI manhunt that put the face of Clark Rockefeller on news broadcasts across the country and in Canada. The Rockefeller family quickly clarified that they had no idea who this guy was, and that he had no connection whatsoever to the famous family. It was this crime, born of desperation and hubris, that would finally solve the slaying he had committed 23 years earlier. A week later, he was arrested in Baltimore, where he had already set up a new life as Chip Smith, a yacht captain. The national publicity surrounding the case blew the lid off his 30-year con. Fingerprints taken after his arrest were matched to prints on an old immigration document. This definitively proved that Clark Rockefeller, Christopher Crowe, and Christopher Chichester were all the same person, Christian Karl Gerhardsreiter. It turned out that he had arrived in America in 1978 as a foreign exchange student and had charmed his way into a sham marriage for a green card. In 2011, While nearing the end of his Massachusetts prison sentence for kidnapping, Christian Gerhartsreiter was charged with the slaying of John Sohus. The trial, which began in 2013, was a masterclass in prosecutorial storytelling. With no strong forensic evidence or witnesses to the crime, the case was built circumstantially. The prosecution wove together a damning narrative from the clues Gerhartsreiter had carelessly left behind. The most crucial pieces of evidence were two plastic bags found wrapped around John's skull. One was from the bookstore at the University of Southern California. The other was from the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. Gerhartsreiter had attended classes at both schools, effectively leaving his calling card in the grave. And honestly, it's things like this that make me wonder how this buffoon was able to pull off his cons for so long. Witnesses from San Marino, now elderly, testified about his strange behavior. A church acquaintance recalled Gerhartsreiter borrowing a chainsaw around the time the couple disappeared. Another remembered him trying to sell a fancy Turco-Persian rug that appeared to have very unusual stains on it. The witness hadn't bought the rug, so it couldn't be tested to prove anything with certainty, but it was yet another piece of evidence against this predatory con man. The defense, acknowledging their client was a grifter, employed a strategy of misdirection that mirrored Gerhartsreiter's own methods. They pointed the finger at the one person who couldn't defend herself, the missing Linda Sohus. They argued that Linda, a tall, physically imposing woman, was more capable of the attack than Gerhartsreiter, which I have to say is probably as audacious as it is disgusting. They entered into evidence the postcards from Paris, which they claimed proved she was alive after John was slain, but despite this, the jury wasn't convinced. I'm going to give you a second to guess how this defense worked out, and I mean a literal second here. In April 2013, after deliberating for less than a day, they found Christian Gerhartsreiter guilty in the first degree. He was sentenced to 27 years to life in prison. The verdict finally brought answers to the family of John Sohus. After nearly 3 decades of uncertainty, the perpetrator had been held accountable, but the conviction only solved half of the mystery that began on that quiet San Marino street in 1985, and the question of what happened to Linda Sohus remains unanswered. Her body has never been found, and she is still officially classified as an endangered missing person. The prevailing theory, held by prosecutors and investigators, is that Gerhartsreiter eliminated her as well, disposing of her body in a location that has never been discovered. The defense's theory that she was the perp who fled was a courtroom tactic unsupported by any evidence whatsoever, aside from the likely fake postcard from Paris. Gerhartsreiter himself has claimed that Linda is still alive, even hinting at his sentencing that he had information about her whereabouts. This appears to have been one last attempt by this sick individual to try to assert power, though it appears no one was buying what he was selling. On a cold November morning in 1982, a Wyoming highway patrolman came upon an eerie scene. A Chevrolet Blazer idling on a remote off-ramp in the middle of the prairie, its doors wide open and personal belongings scattered across the asphalt. The driver, 35-year-old Don Kemp, was nowhere to be found. A single set of footprints trailed away from the vehicle into the snow, as if Kemp had calmly walked off into the wilderness. It would take nearly 3 years before Kemp's remains were finally discovered just a few miles from where his SUV was abandoned. By then, a series of baffling clues, including reported sightings and phone calls from after his disappearance, had turned his fate into one of Wyoming's strangest unsolved mysteries. Don Kemp wasn't an obvious candidate for vanishing into thin air, at least not until everything changed. In the late 1970s, he was a successful Madison Avenue advertising executive in New York City. Intelligent, charismatic, and by all accounts, living the good life. However, a serious car accident in 1976 left him badly injured and needing several years to recover. As he recovered, Kemp became increasingly disillusioned with his high-powered lifestyle and began pursuing spiritual and historical interests. He developed an intense fascination with Abraham Lincoln, even claiming that through meditation, he had contacted one of the conspirators from 1865. By 1982, Kemp had grown deeply reflective and envisioned himself as some kind of prophet or messenger with a great truth to share. He often spoke of grand plans, at one point suggesting he would start a spiritual movement related to Lincoln's legacy in the mountains of Wyoming. Personally, I don't see the connection between Lincoln and Wyoming, but hey, maybe that's just me. Determined to reinvent his life, Don Kemp sold most of his belongings, ended his engagement, and set out in September 1982 on a road trip west to Wyoming. His destination was Jackson Hole, where he hoped the quiet beauty of the mountains would inspire him to write a book about Lincoln's death and his unconventional theories. Along the way, Kemp kept in touch with family via phone calls and postcards. But as he traveled, some friends and relatives noticed changes in his demeanor. In early November, one friend received a distressing call from Don, who was sobbing and almost hysterical for reasons that remain unclear. Others observed that he had become unusually withdrawn and fixated on esoteric topics, even watching movies about people vanishing when he stopped at motels. These signs, subtle at first, hinted that Kemp's mental state might have been deteriorating as he ventured farther from his familiar life. On November 15, 1982, the day before he disappeared, Don Kemp visited a small Western history museum in Cheyenne, Wyoming. Fittingly, it featured exhibits on Abraham Lincoln. He spent 2 hours wandering the galleries alone and spoke to no one. When he left, he accidentally left behind a briefcase containing some very important items. These included his traveler's checks, personal diaries, address book, and even the glasses he needed for driving. Museum staff later confirmed that Kemp phoned about the forgotten items and said he would return for it immediately, but he never showed up. That afternoon, he was seen at a gas station in Laramie and later near the Lincoln Memorial Monument along Interstate 80. This was the last confirmed sighting of Don Kemp while alive. By the next morning, his journey took a dramatic and mysterious turn. On November 16, 1982, at approximately 10 o'clock that morning, a cop found Don Kemp's 1981 Chevy Blazer abandoned near the remote Wagon Hound Rest area off I-80. The vehicle appeared oddly deserted, yet not broken down. The engine was still running, the radio played music into the empty expanse, and all the doors were open. Kemp's personal items were strewn about on the ground, as if dumped or hastily pulled out of the car. 40 miles of empty land separated this spot from the nearest town, making the scene all the more perplexing. Aside from the scattered possessions, the only clue to Don's fate was a single set of footprints in the fresh snow leading away from the roadway and out into the open prairie. There were no tracks suggesting a second person, and the packed contents of the Blazer left little room for any passenger but Kemp himself. It appeared as though he had walked off on his own into the freezing wilderness, a behavior that struck investigators as irrational and dangerous given the winter conditions. A search began immediately, and the cops treated it as a missing person case with no initial suspicion of foul play. Deputies and volunteers scoured the area on foot and by air, following Don Kemp's footprints into the open prairie. About a mile from the highway, searchers found a duffel bag in the sagebrush containing Don's belongings. The tracks continued for miles, leading to an old barn roughly 6 miles from the abandoned car. Inside was a crude campsite, sticks arranged as if for a fire, and 3 of Don's socks. Strangely, no footprints led away from the barn, and investigators believed someone had backtracked to hide their trail. This suggested to them that Don may have been deliberately avoiding searchers. On the third day, a severe blizzard forced authorities to suspend the search. With brutal cold and heavy snow, investigators assumed Don had perished from exposure. For the next few years, the mystery only deepened, and no further trace of Don turned up until October 1985. A group of hunters stumbled upon human remains in a patch of sagebrush approximately 4 miles from the spot where the blazer had been found. The skeleton was identified as Don Kemp. His wallet, driver's license, and other identification were still with the remains. An autopsy couldn't determine an exact cause of death, but found no obvious signs of trauma or foul play. The authorities determined Don had indeed died of exposure to the elements, probably within days of his disappearance, and his body simply went undiscovered. This explanation would seem to neatly close the case, but as it turned out, the evidence didn't add up. The case of Don Kemp veered from tragic to truly bizarre in the months following his disappearance. In the spring of 1983, some 5 months after Kemp presumably died in the Wyoming blizzard, witnesses began reporting that they had seen Don alive in the town of Casper, Wyoming. This is about 150 miles from the spot where his vehicle was abandoned. One person swore they spotted him browsing a traveling exhibit of Abraham Lincoln memorabilia in Casper, which is uncanny given Don's passionate interest in Lincoln's history. Around the same time, a bartender at a Casper tavern told Mary Kemp, his mother, that he distinctly remembered serving Don a drink. The man was certain it was Don because he recalled the customer's Maryland accent and friendly demeanor. These sightings suggested the tantalizing possibility that Don had somehow survived and secretly made his way to Casper. Even more startling was the evidence that came from Don Kemp's longtime friend and former colleague, Judy Aiello. In late February 1983, Judy returned to her New York City apartment after an extended trip overseas, unaware that Don was missing. When she checked her home answering machine, she discovered a series of voice messages left during her absence. The voice on the machine was undeniably Don's, speaking in an urgent tone and leaving a phone number where he could supposedly be reached. Judy was astonished, not only because the voice sounded like her friend, but also because her telephone number was unlisted and known to very few people. In total, she found multiple missed calls and at least 2 recorded messages from the period of late February to April 1983, all seemingly from Don Kemp. Notably, according to the official explanation, this was a time at which Don should have been long deceased. Alarmed and confused, Judy dialed the callback number that Don had provided. What happened next only compounded the mystery. A man answered the phone. Judy asked if Don Kemp was there, to which the person on the other end oddly replied, "Yes." Then he immediately backtracked, said Don was out, and tried to get Judy off the phone as soon as possible. Sensing that this individual knew something, Judy implored him to have Don return her call, but she never heard back. When Judy alerted Mary Kemp and the authorities about these messages, an investigation traced the mysterious phone number to a trailer on the outskirts of Casper. The trailer was being rented at the time by a young man named Mark Dennis, who quickly became a person of interest in Don's case. Mark Dennis was questioned multiple times by Natrona County investigators. He flatly denied having any knowledge of Don Kemp and claimed he never placed any calls to Judy's number. Dennis suggested that perhaps someone else had snuck into his trailer to use the phone line, or that the phone company had made some error. Indeed, it was hard to imagine how a stranger could have obtained Judy Aiello's private number unless Don himself provided it. Police showed Dennis a photograph of Don, but Dennis maintained he had never seen or met him. He even volunteered to take a polygraph test, which reportedly did not uncover any deception. Over the years, Don Kemp's strange death has prompted a range of theories, from the straightforward to the highly speculative. The simplest and officially accepted explanation is that Don experienced a mental breakdown or disorientation and wandered off into the wilderness voluntarily. Proponents of this theory point to Don's fragile psychological state, as well as a head injury suffered in the accident. The single set of footprints, lack of evidence of other people at the scene, and the fact his remains were ultimately found not far from where he disappeared bolster this view. In this scenario, the later phone calls would have to be either an elaborate hoax or a bizarre coincidence, which I find to be an unsatisfying explanation. Don's family firmly believed that he was a victim of foul play. Under this theory, Don encountered a sick puppy, or perhaps a pack of sick puppies, somewhere along that lonely Wyoming highway in November 1982. Under this theory, he was able to briefly place a call to Judy, though for some reason didn't call the police or his family. Officially, the case of Don Kemp is considered solved, though even investigators have admitted that the facts of the official narrative don't fully add up. While I can't square all the evidence, it seems like Don Kemp's mysterious behavior stems from the serious head injury he suffered in his 1976 car accident. Traumatic brain injuries, particularly those affecting the frontal lobe, can lead to profound personality changes, emotional instability, obsessive thinking, and impaired judgment. Don's shift from a focused advertising executive to a man deeply engrossed in bizarre historical ideas may reflect such neurological trauma. It's also possible that Kemp initially wandered into the wilderness, then returned or was taken to Casper, as suggested by credible sightings and strange phone calls. If his mental state fluctuated, he may have become overwhelmed or disoriented again, prompting a second departure into the wild, where he ultimately perished. Imagine soaring 70,000 feet above hostile territory, confident that no enemy weapon can reach you. Francis Gary Powers, a pilot for the CIA, had that confidence on May 1st, 1960, as he piloted a U-2 spy plane over the Soviet Union until a sudden thump and flash of orange light proved him wrong. In an instant, the aircraft lurched out of control, struck by a Soviet surface-to-air missile. Powers desperately tried to stabilize the nose-diving plane, but within moments, he had to eject as it spiraled down over Soviet soil. The ensuing international fallout from this shoot-down would push superpower tensions to a new peak. By 1960, the United States and Soviet Union were locked in a high-stakes chess game, each anxious about the other's nuclear capabilities. President Dwight Eisenhower proposed an open skies plan in 1955, but Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev flatly refused. This plan proposed mutual aerial surveillance between the United States and Soviet Union to reduce surprise nuclear attack risks through transparency and verification. Lacking such transparency, the American government turned to secret high-altitude aerial reconnaissance, an area where there was a significant technological edge over the Soviets. The Lockheed U-2 spy plane was developed to fly at altitudes around 70,000 feet, so high that officials believed it would pass over the Soviet Union undetected. They also believed that it was beyond the reach of Soviet fighters or missiles. While they were right about the former, the latter would be proven very wrong. Starting in 1956, U-2 overflights gathered valuable photographs of Soviet bases and missile sites. The Soviets did track these flights on radar, and even fired on one U-2 in 1959, but Khrushchev kept quiet about these incidents. After all, he didn't yet have any hard proof that these were American planes. Despite his misgivings, Eisenhower allowed U-2 missions to continue for vital intelligence. In April 1960, with a summit looming, he authorized one last deep penetration flight to gather updated intelligence on Soviet nuclear sites. The mission would launch from Pakistan, fly across the breadth of the Soviet Union to photograph key missile sites, and then land in Norway. In the early hours of May 1st, 1960, Powers took off from Peshawar, Pakistan, in a U-2 loaded with cameras. The Soviets weren't caught by surprise. Anticipating an intruder plane, Soviet air defense units were on high alert along the U-2's planned route. As the U-2 slipped into Soviet airspace, fighter jets tried in vain to intercept the high-flying aircraft. When they weren't successful, ground crews then launched a salvo of surface-to-air missiles near Sverdlovsk in the Ural Mountains. At least one missile exploded close enough to blast apart the fragile spy plane. Powers bailed out from the stricken U-2, struggling at first with his oxygen hose but ultimately parachuting to the ground alive. He carried a poison needle hidden in a silver dollar to avoid capture, but he never used it. Powers was promptly seized by Soviet authorities, and wreckage of his U-2 was recovered for all the world to see. The Soviet authorities proudly exhibited the recovered pieces of Powers' aircraft in Moscow, parading the mangled aircraft parts to prove the American espionage. But I'm getting ahead of myself here, since the way the Soviets broke this news to the world was done to maximize the humiliation to Eisenhower. Back in Washington, news that a U-2 had gone missing over the Soviet Union caused a panic. American officials assumed Powers was likely dead, and the plane completely destroyed, so they hastily concocted a cover story. On May 5th, NASA released a press statement claiming a quote-unquote weather research aircraft had, quote, gone missing north of Turkey. And I guess the Soviet Union technically was north of Turkey, and I guess there were probably some weather instruments on the plane. To bolster this lie, the United States even showed off a U-2 painted with fake NASA markings, pretending it was a harmless high-altitude weather plane. Meanwhile, Khrushchev made a shrewd move. He announced on May 5th that an American spy plane had been shot down deep inside Soviet territory. Khrushchev was a masterful political operator, though, and he didn't put all his cards on the table. He omitted the fact that Powers had survived. Believing their ruse was working, American officials stuck to their fabricated tale for several more days, digging a deeper hole. Khrushchev sprang his trap on May 7th. With obvious relish, he revealed to the Supreme Soviet that the captured pilot Powers was alive and well. Not only that, Soviet recovery teams had retrieved the U-2's sophisticated camera equipment for air-to-ground surveillance. This was truly cutting-edge technology, which at the time wasn't publicly acknowledged to even exist. The American weather plane story instantly collapsed in perhaps the most humiliating way possible, and the Soviets weren't going to be modest about what just occurred. Khrushchev mocked the Eisenhower administration's attempted deception, noting that he had deliberately let them tell on themselves with ridiculous cover-up statements. Embarrassed on the world stage, the United States had no choice but to admit that Powers had indeed been on an espionage mission. Eisenhower publicly accepted responsibility, acknowledging the spy flights as necessary for national security in the nuclear age. However, he pointedly refused to apologize to the Soviets for conducting the aerial surveillance. This seemingly small detail would help cause a frosting over of American-Soviet relations that became even more pronounced in the decade to come. Khrushchev's personal relationship with Eisenhower had been improving in the late 1950s, and both sides hoped the upcoming Paris summit on May 16, 1960, would be fruitful. In the days before the conference, hardliners in the Kremlin pressed Khrushchev to respond aggressively to the U-2 provocation. When the summit opened in Paris, the Soviet leader launched into a furious tirade against the U.S. and President Eisenhower, then dramatically stormed out of the meeting. The summit collapsed on day one, with no discussions on arms control or anything else achieved. Eisenhower was left bitterly disappointed, considering it one of the worst debacles of his presidency. Had the incident not occurred, Eisenhower lamented, the talks and even a planned goodwill visit of his to Moscow might have significantly improved East-West relations. The Soviets put Francis Gary Powers on trial in Moscow, staging it as a propaganda spectacle. In August 1960, just months after his capture, Powers pleaded guilty to espionage in a Soviet court and was sentenced to 10 years of confinement. The trial, held in a grand hall and heavily publicized, showcased exhibits of the U-2's wreckage and surveillance photos as evidence of American aggression. Powers, however, wouldn't serve the full sentence. After enduring roughly 21 months in Soviet custody, he was exchanged in a prisoner swap on February 10, 1962. Although Powers returned home to public criticism for not destroying his plane or making the ultimate sacrifice, he was cleared of wrongdoing. That said, this didn't stop the speculation at the time. One persistent theory held that Powers deliberately allowed his U-2 to be shot down in an attempt to defect to the Soviet Union. Under this theory, he allowed his plane to fly lower than it ought to, putting it in range of Soviet missiles. Advocates pointed to the mission's deep penetration route, Powers' failure to trigger the aircraft's self-destruct, and his decision not to use the poison needle. Soviet propagandists amplified these claims, portraying him as a willing turncoat disillusioned with American policy. Yet declassified records and later investigations undermine the idea. Powers had no secure means to guarantee capture alive, no prearranged Soviet contacts, and no realistic expectation of humane treatment. All evidence now indicates his erratic descent resulted from missile damage at a high altitude, and this theory is virtually completely dismissed today. Another more interesting theory is that the true purpose of Powers' mission was to be shot down, tossing a wrench into Soviet-American relations. Under this theory, Powers wasn't in on it at all, but elements within the American intelligence apparatus set him up. If this theory is accurate, the people behind the setup did so in order to stop American-Soviet relations from normalizing. While this idea is tempting and is definitely plausible, there's simply no evidence to support it, so it remains in the realm of speculation. Powers ended up working as a test pilot upon his return home and would eventually become an aircraft and helicopter pilot for a local news station in Los Angeles. Unfortunately, while Powers may have successfully survived one crash, in August 1977, his helicopter went down in Encino. Tragically, this crash resulted in the loss of his life, as well as that of his passenger. As far as I know, Powers is the only person to have 2 Wikipedia articles dedicated to plane crashes where he was the pilot. In October 1979, 19-year-old Lisa Jane Borden phoned her family from California to say she'd be coming home soon. Her loved ones even arranged a plane ticket for her return, but Lisa never showed up to claim it. She had made it all the way from Texas to California on her own, but something, or someone, prevented her from making it back. That brief call was the last time anyone heard from the young Texas woman. Over 4 decades later, her disappearance remains an unsettling cold case, a road trip turned mystery, leaving her family with decades of unanswered questions and heartache. Lisa was from Big Spring, a small West Texas city. In early October 1979, she hitchhiked west to California. For that journey, she likely depended on the kindness of strangers for rides along the highways, an inherently risky way to travel. By October 10th, Lisa had reached the city of Lodi, in California's San Joaquin Valley, and placed a phone call to her family back in Texas. During that call, she reassured them she was safe and planned to return home soon. Her loved ones, including her worried boyfriend, responded by sending her a plane ticket home to be picked up at the airport. Mysteriously, Lisa never retrieved that ticket or boarded any flight. After her conversation from Lodi, she simply vanished without a trace. When Lisa failed to return or contact anyone again, her family grew alarmed. It wasn't like her to cut off communication, especially after travel plans had been made. Sensing something was wrong, Lisa's sister reported her missing to local authorities in Texas. With the case now officially opened, investigators had to retrace Lisa's steps across 2 states. Despite an interstate investigation, the authorities found no physical evidence to reveal Lisa's fate. After her October phone call, there were no confirmed sightings and no belongings or clues left behind to indicate what happened. Detectives confirmed that Lisa had made it to California, but beyond her one phone call, solid clues were scarce. A friend later told the family that Lisa had been spotted back in Texas after her California trip, allegedly living in Amarillo and working as a waitress. This claim briefly raised hopes that Lisa was alive, but the friend provided no details or proof. Authorities were unable to verify the Amarillo story, making it a frustrating dead end and leaving doubt whether the sighting was even real. The Texas Department of Public Safety has classified Lisa's disappearance as an involuntary missing person case. In fact, authorities have stated they believe Lisa may have been taken against her will. Decades after she vanished, investigators updated the case by collecting a DNA sample from her family in 2007 to aid in identification efforts. Her information remains active in national databases, and she's been compared to numerous Jane Doe cases with no success. Over the years, several theories have emerged about what might have happened to Lisa. The leading theory is that she fell victim to foul play during her journey. As a young woman hitchhiking alone in the late 1970s, Lisa was at risk of encountering someone dangerous on the road. In fact, the late 1970s saw a surge of serial violence on the roads. This was an era when serial predators often targeted hitchhikers, and authorities suspect Lisa may have accepted a ride from the wrong person. If she was abducted while traveling, it would explain why she never made it home despite having a ticket waiting. Another consideration is that Lisa could have chosen to disappear and start a new life, though her family finds this unlikely. The Amarillo waitress story was one such lead, though that ultimately went nowhere. However, those who believe that she lived have speculated that she may have fled Amarillo after seeing her old friend where she was working. More than 45 years have passed since Lisa Jane Borden disappeared, and her fate remains unknown. Her family has endured decades of not knowing, holding out hope that one day they might learn what became of her. It's one of the most jarring pivots in modern sports history, a moment where unparalleled jubilation turned into indelible tragedy in less than 48 hours. On Tuesday, June 17, 1986, the Boston Celtics, fresh off another NBA championship, selected the University of Maryland's Len Bias with the second overall pick in the NBA draft. The team's leadership was convinced the young man was the key to extending the Celtics dynasty well into the next generation. Photographers captured Bias beaming while holding up the famed Celtics jersey, number 30, the image of a young man on the cusp of athletic immortality. Yet, by Thursday morning, June 19th, the narrative had shattered completely. The news reports weren't celebrating a future Hall of Famer. They were announcing the death of a 22-year-old from a coke overdose. Bias was born in Landover, Maryland, and excelled as a forward at Northwestern High School in Hyattsville before committing to the University of Maryland. Over his 4 years playing for the Terrapins, from 1982 to 1986, Bias developed into an athletic phenomenon who utterly dominated the Atlantic Coast Conference. The anticipation surrounding his move to the professional level was immense, going far beyond typical draft buzz. Many analysts believed his potential was virtually limitless, and that he could potentially be one of the greatest players of all time if he played his cards right. Experts were even describing him in the same sentence of the already legendary Michael Jordan. The tragic events unfolded swiftly in the early morning hours of June 19, 1986. After returning to his dorm room, Bias joined a small gathering of friends and teammates. Testimony later revealed that sometime between 2:30 a.m. and 3 a.m., Bias, alongside his friends and teammates, began huffing Colombian confetti. The substance was reportedly piled on a mirror in the center of the dorm suite. For the next 3 to 4 hours, the group talked and snorted the polar bear powder. And then it happened. Out of the blue, Bias suffered a seizure and collapsed. A 911 call was placed at 6:32 that morning, reporting that the celebrated athlete was unconscious and not breathing. Despite desperate attempts by emergency medical teams and further efforts at Leland Memorial Hospital in Riverdale, Maryland, Bias was pronounced dead at 8:55. The medical examiner concluded that the cause of death was cardiac arrhythmia brought on by an overdose. Importantly, toxicology reports confirmed that there were no other substances in his system. While the immediate shock focused on the suddenness of his death, the initial public narrative was quickly established by authorities and the media. Bias was an innocent victim, perhaps trying coke only this one time, or possibly even being duped into ingesting it. However, this simple account soon collapsed under the weight of an investigation, and I really question how anyone could have been so naive as to believe that story. Grand jury testimony from Bias's teammates contradicted the prevailing story, indicating that Bias had reportedly used the substance almost 10 times prior. The revelation of Bias's drug use and the ensuing police investigation immediately hurled the University of Maryland and its athletic department into deep turmoil. The focus quickly shifted from the personal tragedy of the athlete to the integrity of the institution responsible for managing him. Allegations of a major cover-up within the athletic program soon emerged. State Attorney Arthur Marshall publicly alleged that in the hours after Bias's collapse, Maryland's head basketball coach had instructed players to destroy any substances they had. Importantly, this allegation was never proven in a court of law, but that didn't matter. This claim of obstruction, combined with the wider questions about the special treatment afforded to top college athletes, signaled a systemic failure at the highest levels of the university. The administration launched full investigations into the athletic program's academic standards and drug use policies. The ensuing controversy was so devastating that it forced high-level resignations, including those of the basketball head coach and the athletic director, amongst others. The grand jury investigation led to criminal charges against those present during Bias's death. Brian Tribble, Bias's friend, was indicted on multiple serious counts, including possession of coke and possession with intent to distribute. Teammates Terry Long and David Gregg also faced charges of possession and obstruction of justice. They were suspended from the basketball team shortly thereafter. Despite the overwhelming public pressure and the severity of the charges, the state justice system ultimately failed to secure any convictions related directly to Bias's death. In June 1987, a jury acquitted Brian Tribble of all charges concerning distribution and possession in the Bias case. Prosecutors later dismissed the misdemeanor charges against Long and Gregg as well. Len Bias's death occurred at a specific moment when politicians were eager to be seen as tough on drugs, and the media was heavily focused on the dangers of crack. This is, of course, despite the fact that Len Bias and his friends hadn't been smoking Timu nose candy at all. The political machinery moved with astonishing speed. Committees in the House began writing anti-drug legislation within weeks of Bias's passing. The legislative process bypassed normal deliberation and research, driven by political expediency and public panic. The resulting legislation, the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986, was signed into law by President Ronald Reagan on October 27, 1986. This was brought in just 4 months after Bias's death, and to many observers, the connection between the law and the actual facts of his case weren't readily apparent. This new federal statute, often dubbed the Len Bias Law, dramatically escalated penalties for substance-related crimes. The key provision established harsh mandatory minimum sentences, specifically targeting cases where drug distribution led to the death or serious bodily injury of the user. For such offenses, the law mandated a minimum prison term of 20 years and a maximum life sentence, even for a first-time offender. Crucially, the law made no distinction between a major international trafficker and an individual who gave a friend a dose for free. If death resulted, both could be charged and face life imprisonment. This elimination of judicial discretion, enacted in a political fever pitch, fundamentally reshaped the American criminal justice system. The Len Bias Law is frequently cited as a primary catalyst for the explosion of mass incarceration in the decades that followed. Some have, of course, speculated that the law was already pre-planned and that politicians were simply waiting for the right national tragedy to capitalize upon. On the night of March 20th, 1995, 17-year-old Julie Ferguson left work at the Linens and Things store in Greenbelt, Maryland, and prepared to go out with friends. She was a junior at Eleanor Roosevelt High School, a bright, vivacious teen known for her love of music and close bonds with her friends. Around 9:30 p.m., after closing up the store, Julie waited outside in the Greenway Shopping Center for two friends who had promised to give her a ride that evening. Moments before, she had reassured her mother by phone that her friends were on their way to pick her up. The area was well lit by a nearby liquor store, and Julie sat on a brick planter box with a soda and a shopping bag by her side. Sometime before 10 p.m., witnesses saw Julie casually chatting with the occupants of a red four-door car that had pulled up near where she waited. There were 3 people in the vehicle, reportedly 2 young men and a young woman, and by all accounts, Julie seemed comfortable speaking with them. Observers noted no signs of distress or struggle at that time. However, by the time her friends arrived just after 10 p.m., Julie had vanished without a trace. All that remained were her belongings on the curb, including a bag of clothes and her soda bottle. Alarmed, her friends contacted Julie's mother and questioned the liquor store manager, quickly realizing something was terribly wrong. Within hours, Greenbelt police, aided by police helicopters, began searching the area for the missing teen. Tragically, the search ended early the next morning. At around 5:20 a.m. on March 21st, a pair of workers on their way to their job spotted Julie's body near a wooded stretch of Daisy Lane in Glendale, about 5 miles from the shopping center. She was found fully clothed on the remote roadside, and the manner of her death was brutal. An autopsy later revealed that Julie had been strangled and her throat had been slashed. There were no signs of essay, robbery, or any obvious motive for the attack. Simply put, there was absolutely nothing to explain why someone would target a normal girl who was just going about her evening. Julie's slaying sent shockwaves through the Greenbelt community, which was unaccustomed to such violent crime. In the days that followed, police worked around the clock interviewing dozens of people, but they struggled to develop solid leads. No immediate suspect emerged, and detectives could not determine a clear motive for the crime. Julie had no apparent enemies, and nothing obvious had been taken from her. Investigators quickly concluded that she had been abducted from the shopping center, but by whom and for what purpose remained a complete mystery. The only early clues were the witness accounts of the red car and the disturbing fact that some of Julie's personal items had been discarded along a roadway. Her ID, for instance, was later found tossed in the median of Greenbelt Road, about halfway between the mall and the location where her body was found. It appeared those responsible had scattered a few of her belongings while fleeing the area. The impact on Julie's peers was profound. 2 days after the slaying, well over 1,000 people gathered for a candlelight vigil at the Eleanor Roosevelt High School football field to mourn Julie and seek solace together. Grief counselors were made available to students overcome by the shock of losing a classmate in such a horrific way. Friends described feeling as if all the safety and all the security of their world had been stripped away overnight. Despite an intensive investigation in 1995, the case gradually went cold as months and then years passed without an arrest. The crime scene yielded little forensic evidence beyond some physical items belonging to Julie, and with no eyewitnesses to the abduction itself, detectives had few leads to pursue. About 5 years after the slaying, in March 2000, Prince George's County Police announced a renewed push in Julie's case, and with it, some intriguing new clues. Cold case investigators had spent months re-examining the evidence and re-interviewing witnesses. At a press conference on the case's 5-year anniversary, police revealed that previously overlooked witness accounts pointed to 3 suspects who might have been involved. Crucially, multiple people had reported seeing a red Volkswagen Jetta in the Greenway Center parking lot the night Julie disappeared. The occupants were described as 2 men and 1 woman in their early 20s, and all were noted to be black. One witness saw Julie leaning in the window of this car, talking to the occupants shortly before she vanished. Another witness came forward to say they had spotted a similar vehicle in the early morning hours parked along a remote stretch of Daisy Lane, with its headlights on. Notably, this was in the very area where Julie's body was later discovered, giving rise to suspicions that this may have been the occupants of the vehicle dumping her body. By the time that witness passed the spot again, the car was gone. Around this same period, police explored a lead involving a different possible suspect entirely. They identified a person of interest, who was a white male, who was believed to have been preying on young women near the University of Maryland campus in the mid-1990s. This individual was thought to have attempted abductions in the area, raising suspicions that Julie could have been a victim of a serial predator. However, after extensive efforts, investigators were unable to track that man down or link him to the crime. The focus remained on the trio in the red car, even as the case once again began to stall for lack of concrete proof. Over the years, several theories have emerged about who was responsible for the slaying of Julie Ferguson, but many have led to dead ends. Aside from the theories already discussed, 2 young men who knew Julie were also investigated as possible suspects. However, both of them failed to match up to DNA found at the scene, and there was nothing concrete to link either men to the abduction and subsequent events. The primary theory that law enforcement still focuses on centers around the 3 unknown individuals in the red car. Investigators have urged any of these 3 people to come forward for questioning in an effort to potentially clear their names if they weren't involved.